Thank you so much. Rather than read excerpts of the book that you could check out of this beautiful library or hopefully win tonight or buy if the spirit moves you, I thought I would tell you a little bit about how the book came to be and some of the individuals and why I chose to feature them in this book. So, seventh generation earth ethics. And if you're not familiar with this principle, it's a philosophy that basically tells you when you make major decisions to think about how those decisions will affect generations 7 into the future. So you're thinking 240 years into the future. And it makes a difference than if you plant a pine, which you'll enjoy in your lifetime, or an oak that maybe your grandchildren will enjoy, but you won't reap the benefits from. So it's a philosophy that encourages selflessness. And I sure wish that along with Rousseau and Kant and Hume and all those other philosophers that I read in Philosophy 101 in college, that I would have read something like this, because I think it's really useful, especially now when we find ourselves confronted with some really important environmental choices. I also want to tell you how this book came about. And so I have to tell you a story of my epiphany as a historian. Because I grew up, I'm a public school child, and I went to public elementary schools and high schools. I went to UW La Crosse for my undergraduate degree. I got my master's and PhD from UW-Madison. And I'm grateful for my education. My degrees say communication, but really it's communication history, and I've always thought of myself more as a historian than anything else. So what's history? Well, the way we're taught in school is history is linear, right? You pick a beginning date and you pick an end date and a theme or a topic, and then you sort of plug in all the names and dates and events with a real heavy emphasis on wars and policy and military leaders and presidents. And then you come to the end and you have a history. And so as I look back on my early academic career, I see that I may be Native American, I may be a Bad River Ojibwe woman, but my mind was pretty colonized. And while I maybe was a little bit more sympathetic toward Native history and maybe knew that, okay, most of the histories of Native people have been written by non-Native people, even though I understood that, really the kind of histories that I was doing as I look back at my early work, anybody could have written them. And if you go to the library here or a library like the State Historical Society, and you go to the E98 section, you will see tens of thousands of books that purport to be about Native American history. They're not. They're histories, they're better histories of the people that wrote them, the explorers, the missionaries, the government officials. And I would argue that you can learn more about them than you can learn about Native people. There's some really important stuff in there, and I use that all the time. I use those print sources. But with my first book, I resolved to try to write a history that reflected the way Native people reconstruct the past through pictographs and petroglyphs and dances and songs and the oral histories that I collected from the people in this book. But the story I want to share with you is when I had my epiphany, because it was in 1997, and I had been asked, it was the year before the Wisconsin sesquicentennial, and the state was preparing to celebrate Wisconsin's statehood. And they kind of remembered at the last moment, oh yeah, we should invite the tribes to participate. And they were surprised when the tribes weren't exactly doing backflips over the opportunity to help celebrate Wisconsin's statehood. And the state eventually came to understand that the prosperity that the state was celebrating came at somebody's expense, and that somebody were the native original people in this state who eventually agreed to commemorate the event. And I was asked to help create a walk-through public history display that told their story. And each community had its own panel, and then there were some unifying themes, environmental themes, and boarding school education, and military service. The fact that military enlistment rates are 3 times higher in Native communities than they are with any other race or ethnic group, which surprises people. So I was researching the Moe Lake panel, the Secaucus Ojibwe, who at the time were battling Exxon, which wanted to place a large open pit sulfide mine 1,600 feet away from Rice Lake, the last inland wild rice lake in the state. And so when I got to Moe Lake and said, the strategy that I had taken was I would go to the elders and say, who should I talk to? What do you want to say? I'm your wordsmith. I'm not going to write your history. Tell me who I should talk to, and then I'll help create this panel for you. So everybody was fixated on the Exxon mine. And they said, go talk to Chief Charles Ackley and ask him about the Crandon mine. That's what they wanted on their panel. So I went to his house and knocked on the door and introduced myself. And he was very accommodating and came out on the porch to talk to me. And I said, I've been asked to come here and ask you about the Crandon mine. So for the next 2 hours, he told me the Ojibwe creation story. And I was a television reporter, and I'll tell you, it took everything, we're used to, you ask a question, you get an answer, and then you edit it down to 15 seconds. Complex world problems in 15 seconds. But first of all, I was just captivated because I had never heard some of these stories before. And I felt like I was being given this amazing gift. And he was so interesting. So I didn't say, but what about the Crandon mine? And then he told me, the next couple of hours, he told me the migration story about how the Ojibwe were originally in the upper Great Lakes region. Then there was a flood, presumably when the glaciers were melting. And we moved to the East Coast where the land was drier and habitable. And then after the glaciers receded, then we came back to our original area. But there was a whole lot of other, that doesn't do it justice at all. I will say, okay, so we're on the East Coast. There's a prophecy. There's a woman there's a woman who has a dream. There's a prophecy. The dream tells her that the Ojibwe are going to be destroyed unless they return to their original homelands. And then people are visioning and fasting and praying. There's a crisis that is predicted, and the people remember that there are 7 stopping places that are described in this prophecy. There's a mega shell that will appear that will lead the people back to the original homes where the food grows on water. I've just taken a 3-hour story and condensed it to 45 seconds, but that's it in a nutshell. And I could go off on a tangent and tell you that I think the crisis is European diseases introduced through the Indian trade routes, through the Norse colonists, through the Vikings that settled in Newfoundland. and that the Miga shell in the sky is the Crab Nebula exploding in the year 1054. So, but that's a future book. Anyway, so meanwhile, back to my story. I have been with Chief Ackley for 4 hours. He's not once mentioned the Crandon mine, and I have had the good sense not to interrupt him. And he says, "You want to see something?" And he goes in his house, and he comes back with 2 treaty medals bearing the likeness of John Quincy Adams. And the portraits are sort of rubbed down. They're, you can tell that they've been handled a lot, and there are these sort of grimy red, white, and blue tattered remnants of ribbons. And he says, "Hold these." I mean, it was very purposeful. And so I'm holding these medals, and I have to say I'm pretty amazed. And he's just told me these amazing stories, and I'm holding these medals, and I said, "Well, tell me about this. What have I got here?" And he said, "That's our sovereignty." When them, and it was really interesting because later his whole demeanor shifts, but he's kind of a northern Wisconsin kind of guy. When them Europeans came and then them Americans came, they knew that this was our land and that they had to enter into treaties with us in order to get it from us. And so they knew that this land was ours, and they knew that we were sovereign over it. And I'm looking at these medals, and he says, "You think that's something?" He goes back into his house, and he comes back. I am not exaggerating. This book is about this thick, this big tome that has every treaty, that's every Indian nation that ever entered into treaty negotiations with the United States government. It's in this book, along with a lot of supporting documents and letters and that missionaries and other people have written in support of the treaties that were negotiated, or just supplemental documents. So he says, again, looks at me really purposefully and says, "Hold this." So I put the treaty medals, these priceless treaty medals, under my armpits to hold this book, and he's flipping through it, and he gets to the Ojibwe section, and there's all this hen scratching in the margins. And I said, what's this? And he goes, "Well, my father, Chief Willard Ackley, after the treaties were signed, some of you may know this, but the Ojibwe signed 3 cession treaties that essentially transferred the land, that's euphemistically put, transferred the land from essentially northern, Stevens Point, if you know where Big Old Plain Reservoir is, north, in 3 separate treaties. And there were parts in Michigan and Minnesota as well. And in exchange, it very explicitly says that the Ojibwe reserve the right to hunt, fish, and gather rice upon the waters. And so here's this big treaty book that has those 3 treaties in it and the articles. And after Wisconsin became a state in 1848, it began to create its infrastructure and departments. It eventually created a conservation department, which evolved into the Department of Natural Resources. But the assumption was that when Wisconsin became a state, that everything, every place, and every body within the physical boundaries of the state were under the jurisdiction of the state of Wisconsin. And if you know a little bit about the law, or if you've ever read the Constitution or the Trade and Intercourse Act of 1792, maybe? Can't remember. I'm not good at dates. Some historian. I'm not very good at dates. It says treaties are the supreme law of the land, and it very explicitly says that states, individuals, groups may not enter into treaty negotiations with Indians. This, in the grand scheme of federalism, this is one of those powers that very explicitly is reserved for the federal government. So the state of Wisconsin, as we learned in the 1970s, really didn't have any jurisdiction. This was a compact that was written between these Indian nations and the federal government, not the state of Wisconsin. So here I am with this big book, and he's describing how his father, Willard Ackley, would take the book down to the Forest County Sheriff's Department when tribal members were arrested for hunting, fishing, and gathering off their reservation. He would take this big treaty book down there and say, look at Article 3, and in 1842, Article 7, and sometimes it would work, most times it wouldn't. But there was a really heavy price to be paid. When you have families that are living on a subsistence basis and hunting, fishing, and gathering, and you take the breadwinner or the hunter, and the hunter gets thrown in jail and weapons confiscated, people starve and children die. So this was so important to the Ojibwe people, and this is why what happened during the 70s and 80s happened in northern Wisconsin, and why people were willing to put their lives on the line. It wasn't really about fish, it was about these treaty rights. So I've got the treaty medals under my armpits, and I'm holding the book, and he says, "You think that's something?" And I'm thinking, put the medals behind my knees, the book. But he took everything from me, and he said, "Follow me." And so I followed him into the woods, and he took me to this rock shelter, this cave. It's kind of an open cave. And he went from this northern Wisconsin kind of dropping his G's, walking and talking and thinking, and to this orator who stood up tall, and he began to recite this story that had been told to him when he was a boy of about 7 or 8 by his grandmother, who, when she was an old woman, she told him the story that related to a time when she was about his age. This is the Battle of Moe Lake in 1810 or 11, I think, maybe 1809. When the Ojibwe came back from the East Coast, back to the place where the food grows on water, the Dakota had moved in, and there were these fierce battles over wild rice beds. Wild rice is a superfood. It has a really high protein content. If you dry it, it will last for years and years and years, and it will keep you through the worst of the winters. So this was, whoever controlled the rice beds, survived. So there were these tremendous battles, and in this last battle that he was describing to me, there were runners from the western part of the Ojibwe Nation that came east to warn that the Sioux were coming with 500 or more warriors. And the Ojibwe sent out runners to all the Ojibwe communities in and around present-day northern Wisconsin, Michigan, into Canada. And the Moe Lake Ojibwe hid the women and children in this very cave that I was standing in with Chief Ackley. And he's describing what he is reciting what his grandmother had told him in a very formal oratory sort of fashion, and about how she could hear screams. The hand-to-hand combat lasted 3 days. Everybody in that cave was terrified. The women were trying to keep the children quiet. At the end of the 3 days, the brush that had been pulled over the top of the cave was pulled back, and there was just this moment of terror. And then they saw an Ojibwe face, and there was just this incredible relief until they left the cave and realized the price that had been paid. Everyone, the casualties were enormous. Everyone had lost a son or a father or a brother. And how over the next week, this horrible task of trying to deal with dead bodies and finding, this sort of shallow ravine and cleaning the bodies and putting the bodies of both the Sioux and the Ojibwe together in this mass grave. And now I have been with this man for almost 8 hours, and he's never once mentioned the Crandon mine. But I am, you know, just transfixed. It was the most amazing 8 hours I've ever spent with another human being. And as he's describing this horrible process of trying to honor the dead quickly, because there were so many of them, and there were so few warriors left, and it was mostly women and children and old people left. He looked at me and he said, and that's why the Crandon mine can't go here, because, and he pointed to where, you know, what they call Spirit Hill, where these warriors were buried. And he said, that's where they're buried. And, you know, he didn't use the word covenant, but he said, but it was like he took this thread and pulled it, and everything that he had told me came full circle. And I realized history isn't about time, it's about place. And I mean, I get goosebumps just thinking about that. It completely changed everything I thought about history. You know, the way he described it was, you know, that mind can't go here because this is where the Creator put us. This is the covenant. He didn't use that word, but this is the promise that we got from our Creator, that if we followed the directions, we would come back to where the food grows on water. And the treaties that we signed, you know, are evidence that we tried to protect that place. And the you know, the wars that we fought with the Dakota over this, and it was like I finally got it, that history conceived in Indian country is about a place, and everything worth remembering, ceremony, religion, law, policy, history, everything is remembered as it relates to that place. And that, you know, for somebody who thought, sorry, I get excited, somebody who thought, you know, she was writing Native histories, I realized I have gotten it all wrong. So that put me on a better path, and but I still am constantly fighting this notion of my colonized mind. And it's a tightrope. You know, you write a history book, and people go to a bookstore or a library expecting to read a history book, and so you have to kind of give them something that feels like a history book, but I am also trying to tell it in a way that privileges all those non-print kinds of sources, and trying to relate history, not a sanitized history, but history the way Native people remember it. And when I finished my first book, I had readers in each community who read my book, and sometimes the time, space thing would trip me up. I remember writing in the Mohican chapter, writing that the Mohicans were gardeners who moved their villages every 10 years or so when they exhausted their garden soil. And I sent it up to the Mohican Reservation, and Dot David and the Mohican History Committee read it, and Dot called me up and said, "That sounds so white. Why don't you just say, we moved our villages as often as was necessary?" So delete, 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 delete 10 years, moved as often as was necessary. I send it off to the Wisconsin Historical Society, not the editor that saw the book through, but the first editor who wound up retiring, I think, a couple of months into my book project. And I get the book back, and in the exact same place, it was, could you be more precise about the datage here? Would you say every 5 years or 10 years? Anyway, so where I started with that first book was with the people in this book. And these were the people that community folks said, you should talk to Walt Brissett. You should talk to Joe Rose. You should write about the Thunders. And I remember thinking as I was doing some of my earlier work, you know, somebody ought to write a book about Walt Brissett. Man, that guy is so interesting. Why doesn't somebody write about Walter Brissett? And I was, well, I'm going to write about Walter Brissett, who came up with this 7th generation amendment, not passed, but It's really kind of a beautiful concept. The right of citizens of the United States to use and enjoy air, water, wildlife, and other renewable resources determined by the Congress to be common property shall not be impaired, nor shall its use impair their availability for the use of future generations. Again, embodying that selflessness. We're going to protect things not just for us, but for our grandchildren and their grandchildren. So I chose one biography from each of the 12 Native communities in Wisconsin. And I chose people whose life stories really spoke to bigger themes. So treaty rights or environmental creative expression, Truman Lowe's chapter. And I realized that environment was maybe too limiting, that maybe it was better to talk about these individuals who were responsible for helping to sustain their communities. Started with Walt Brissett. What an interesting guy, born on the 4th of July, and I think I wrote that he spent his whole life sort of lobbing shells and stirring things up. One of my favorite stories about, so he was the co-founder of the Wisconsin Green Party and a spokesperson during the treaty rights era. Was a communications specialist, worked for Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. There's him on train tracks. He and some other Bad River Ogichida, that's our word for warrior, there was a plan to do solution mining at a mine in northern Michigan, which is you take really heavy elements, arsenic, cyanide, sulfur, sulfides, and you dilute it with water and you flush out an old, not abandoned mine, but a mine that had been closed in order to dissolve the rock and gather the trace minerals. And the train loaded with these chemicals had to cross Bad River on tracks that had not been updated since the 1920s. And I mean, there are railroad trestles, am I right? You can literally shake people's hands through some of these railroad trestles. And so the Ogichida lit a sacred fire on the tracks and said that train is not, with that stuff, is not coming on our reservation. And what was really, there was this standoff that lasted for quite a few days. And what was really interesting, there were people who were talking about boycotting the casino and who really felt that, mining offered jobs, and then there was a horrible train derailment in Waiawega. I don't know if some of you remember that, but 14 cars went off the tracks, and it was carrying these agricultural fertilizers. Some of the cars exploded. The entire town had to be evacuated. $27 million in damage, and then the same people that were talking about boycotts were bringing muffins to the next day, bringing baskets of goodies to the warriors, going, all right, keep it up. My other favorite story about Walt is in the mid-1990s, the Ku Klux Klan, for some reason, decided that they were going to do, you're shaking your head, you know this, decided that they were going to do a membership drive and do a parade in Ironwood, Michigan, of all places. And I was going to say the good city fathers, but there was a female mayor at the time. I mean, the town mothers and fathers were horrified. And there were a lot of people who wanted to go there and confront the KKK and let them know that they weren't welcome in Ironwood. And so there were a lot of counter protests that people were gearing up for. And Walt, who had this great sense of drama, he had some theater background as well. First of all, talked to people that insisted that they were going to line the parade route to when the Klan went by, rather than engaging them, just silently turned their backs. And he talked the mayor of Ironwood into opening up the fire hydrants in back of the KKK, and he got all the church people to come to the main street with brooms and mops and scrub brushes. And when the fire hydrants were open, they scrubbed the hatred off the streets. Yeah, I mean that's the way to do a protest, right? Oh, and he had his whole life was filled with these great symbolic moments. He once somebody had gifted him Black Hawk's tomahawk, his war club, and during a mining demonstration, Walt may have broken a few laws by hopping a hurricane fence or two, but climbed onto this big clam digger and counted coup with, on this machine. Yeah, he's a really interesting individual. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Wrong button. Franny Van Zyl. These were some of the Moe Lake activists. I'm not going to. There are 12 chapters, 12 individuals, so I'm not going to go through each one, but I'll stop. I want to spend a little time, since we have a Citizen Band Potawatomi person in here, I want to stop on the Potawatomi slide. But Franny Van Zyl was somebody that the first time I met her, I was doing a story for, I can't remember if it was Wisconsin Public Television or the ABC affiliate in Madison. But when we got to her house, we were going to do an interview, and we walked in the door, and she was cooking all this food. And as a journalist, you're taught not to, you shouldn't cozy up to your story subjects. You try to maintain objectivity, and I was already dealing with that because as a Native woman, I'm covering these treaty rights cases, and some of my relatives are people that are spearing out on the lakes, and so I was already really wrestling with a lot of ethical issues about how much I was comfortable. And so we walk into this woman's house, and she has all this food made for us, and I'm trying to explain to her that well, let's do the interview first. And I'm thinking maybe I can graciously, and she sit down. Look, okay, set time. You don't understand. Treaty rights are not about spearing fish. It's about being able to eat the food that makes me Native. I'm Ojibwe because of the food I eat. I eat wild rice. I eat deer. I can't be Ojibwe if I don't have my wild rice and my deer and my venison, my wild rice, my fish. This is who I am. You are what you eat, and I am somebody who exists on this food. And if they put that mine in there, I'm not going to be able to have access to this good food, and I can't be Ojibwe if I can't have access to my food. And I just remember her being so adamant about how food, and now, of course, everybody's talking about food sovereignty. It's a huge issue in Indian country, and Native communities are insisting on access to traditional food, saying this is a matter of survival for us. We have some of the highest rates of diabetes and cancer and heart disease, and a lot of it is just generations of really, really crappy food, commodity food that the government sends to reservations. The way dairy price supports work is the government buys up milk products for its school lunch programs and to send to Indian reservations. And what's really interesting is that a majority of Native people are lactose intolerant. We didn't practice animal husbandry. We were hunters, fishers, and gatherers. We didn't do that kind of. We didn't domesticate animals. So anyway, Franny came out of retirement during the Gogabek Taconite struggle, and rallied a lot of people at the Capitol. Joe Rose is probably has been my mentor more than anyone else at Bad River. Amazing guy, He has advanced degrees. He's got a master's degree in education, another one in biology. He was a professor at Northland College and the director of the Native American Studies program. He speaks Ojibwe. He's, I don't know, the equivalent of, if this were if Bad River was the Vatican, he'd be a white smoke cardinal in the traditional religion. I don't know how else to describe it. And he's just an amazing fellow that has done a lot for the community in terms of mining and all kinds of projects through the years.
He just won a county board supervisors.
Yes, yep. He's an Ashland County Board supervisor. He's the tribe's representative on the Void Intertribal Task Force. Hillary Sparky Wakaw is somebody that I had admired for years. Menominee elder, you may know about Menominee termination, really unfortunate experiment in the 1950s. The Menominee had a small amount of money that was basically used to blackmail them into accepting termination. And it meant that they were not Indian anymore. They went from being American Indians to Indian Americans, like Polish Americans or German Americans or Asian Americans. And they lost their church. They lost, I'm sorry, not their church. They lost their hospital, tremendous brain drain. And eventually it was undone. Ada Deer went to Washington, and with a lot of other people were able to get Menominee's federal recognition back, and the tribal sovereignty was restored and recognized. And it was left with two tiers of government. There was a tribal government and there was a county. Menominee became the poorest. How many counties do we have? 72 or 76? 72. It became the poorest county in Wisconsin. Still, I think still probably is the poorest county in Wisconsin. But Hillary was the county board supervisor. And during the, he was such a pillar of strength and is almost single-handedly responsible for the outstanding resource waters designation for the Wolf River. But during the Ojibwe spearfishing mess, at one point, the Wisconsin Counties Association sponsored an event in Salt Lake City, Utah, with a number of other counties around the country. And basically, the first thing on the agenda was the abrogation of Indian treaty rights throughout the country. And Hillary is the county board supervisor of Menominee County, and Menominee County was a dues-paying member of the Wisconsin Counties Association. So Hillary registered for the convention, and when he went out there, they wouldn't let him in because he was Indian. And so he called all the news media and did this news conference on the steps of the Utah State House, and I'll never forget it. He said, "Only cockroaches do their business in the dark." So he was a pretty interesting fellow. Thomas St. Germain, wow, what a character. So his life story is just, you couldn't write a biography like this. I mean, I couldn't write a fictional piece to the extent I could write his factual life story. And the reason he's in this book is because he argued Ojibwe treaty rights 50 years before the case came up in the 70s. He was arguing Ojibwe treaty rights in the 30s and 40s. But what was so interesting about him is he played conservatively at least 11 years of college football. He went to he was at Carlisle. But he started out at Haskell, and then he went to Highland Park where he got a law degree. Then he went to Carlisle, and he played 2 years at Haskell, 4 years at Highland Park, went to Carlisle, played a year at Carlisle, came to UW-Madison, played 2 years there, then went to Yale and played at Yale, and then in 1922, he came out of retirement and played, at age 44, he played the line for the Oorang Indians, which was one of the first NFL teams. And it was managed by, help me, the famous Jim Thorpe. So what was really interesting, the Oorang Indians, which were based, back then anybody could buy an NFL team for $100. That was the cost of a franchise. And the owner of the Oorang Indians, this was a Ohio team. Oorang was the name of a stud dog owned by an Airedale Terrier breeder. And he thought that owning an NFL team would be a good way to advertise his stud services. So during the quarters, so he had Jim Thorpe get only Indians, and they thought that that would be a way, people would be really interested if there were Indians, an all-Indian team. So here's this guy at age 44 playing the line in the NFL, and during the quarters, the owner would bring out his Airedales, and they would, he'd have them in costumes, and they'd twirl around, and they'd jump through flaming hoops and things. And so that was the quarter entertainment. And then, and this is so icky, at halftime, he would have his team, his native football players, go in the locker room, come out dressed in stereotypic war paint feathers, and they would do Wild West sort of reenactments of, like Custer's Last Stand and that sort of thing as halftime entertainment. So it was, and along the way, he had a weakness for white women and wound up fathering a child with the daughter of a Philadelphia financier whose daddy wouldn't let him marry her. So she went back to Philadelphia, and then he hooked up with another wealthy woman who was the daughter of a Davenport, Iowa financier. And on the night before their wedding, the Philadelphia honey shows up with the child, and there's a big, he momentarily leaves the Davenport babe, and then the Philadelphia, he and the Philadelphia woman have a falling out. Her dad has him arrested, and he does a jailhouse interview with the Chicago Tribune. And he married, but in the middle of all this, he marries the Davenport woman while the Philadelphia woman is there. And then when he gets thrown into jail and the Davenport babe finds out that he's fathered a son with this Philadelphia woman, she runs off back to Davenport and opens up a mahjong parlor. And then the next time I find her, she's living in Santa Monica and calling herself a widow. So it was pretty interesting. That's an interesting chapter. If you're going to read one chapter in my book, has nothing, less to do with environmentalism than it does with just this amazing character. What a life he lived. Jim Schlender was the director of he was the first director of the Great Lakes, the first real director of the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, which had the responsibility of safeguarding treaty rights for the Ojibwe in the 3 states during this horrible era. Caroline Andler, Brothertown. How many of you knew that there was an Indian nation in Wisconsin called Brothertown? It's like, most people don't know. They're not federally recognized. They're the only Indian nation in Wisconsin that's not federally recognized. And she started on butcher block paper writing names of Brothertown tribal members and and 12 years later had 47,000 names. The tribe has been trying to get its federal recognition, and they need, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs wants paper evidence. Marriage licenses, death death reports, death certificates. And I mean, this is a community that is steeped in oral tradition. So it's been a real uphill, oh, I did that again, an uphill climb. Wanda McFagan, this is one of the most poignant chapters. She really lived a pretty sad life, made a lot of really poor decisions, and they were so poor. She had her children taken away from her at one point, a couple of times actually, and I mean, she just opened up her heart to me, and I remember spending an awful lot of time with her, saying, "You don't have to. I mean, I don't need to tell this part of your story, or how does this sound? We can just I can kind of write passive sentences here and, lack a little agency." And she said, "No, I want you to tell my story honestly, because I want other Native women not to make the mistakes I made." Just amazing, amazing woman. Dorothy David's one of my favorite stories about Dorothy. There's a hall named after her at UW-Stevens Point. She was the first Native woman to graduate from first Native woman to graduate from UW-Stevens Point. And when she finished high school, she wanted to go to college, didn't know, their high school didn't have guidance counselors or anything like that. Nobody from her tribe had ever gone to college before. And so she decided she wanted to be a teacher. So back then, Stevens Point was a normal school where teachers were trained. So her brother borrowed a car and drove her to Stevens Point. She showed up at the dean's, the dean of women's office and said, "I'm here for college." And the dean said, "Oh, do you have your GPA?" And Dorothy went, "Well, do you have your transcripts?" It was like a foreign language, GPA transcripts. "Well, did you matriculate?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, I did that when I was 14. Bill Golnick, Oneida, Director of Legislative Affairs, Chief of Staff, he shepherded the tribe through a really dark period of time when they were trying to get their New York land claims through, and had brokered a deal that fell apart at the last moment. And he's now out in California trying to help a newly recognized tribe, Viejo Band they're in the valley near Sacramento. Jenny and Mary Thunder. So these two women, the Potawatomi's beautiful health clinic in Leona near Crandon on the Forest County Potawatomi Reservation, is dedicated to these two women. Back during the turn of the century, there were virtually no doctors, white, Native, or otherwise, in Forest County. Forest County was very thinly populated. It's mostly federal forest and county forest and state forest, thus the name Forest County. And these women had learned traditional medicines. They knew how to use the medicines that grew in their area. They also delivered a lot of babies, oftentimes, using sterilizing butcher string, and you'd get butcher block paper and it would be tied with string. They would salvage string from some of the shops in Crandon and sterilize them in frying pans, and that was what they used to tie off umbilical cords for the babies that they would deliver. And these women routinely, they would put on snowshoes and routinely walk 14, 15 miles a day, ministering to people, delivering babies. during this period of time, somewhere between 15 and 30% of the adult population in Forest County had tuberculosis, and there were no facilities there were no sanitaria or sanatoria for adult Indians. Children, there were sanitaria that were located hundreds of miles away, and so children would be taken from their homes and placed. A lot of them died, but the adults, there was nothing. So, and TB, as you know, is highly contagious, and so people were passing it on from one to another. It was just running rampant, as was trachoma, which was an eye disease, and diphtheria was another problem at the time. And so these women, and they, you know, they weren't getting paid. Sometimes people would give them part of, you know, a deer haunch or wild rice. So it was all bartering, and these women saved an awful lot of lives. The son of Jenny Thunder here on the right was the elder that gave my youngest son his Indian name when he was 18 months. We don't name our children at birth. We wait until the plates close. What's been passed down is that the children aren't yours until the plates, they're still the creators. And so until the plates fuse, you don't give them a name. Truman Loew, no relation. Amazing artist. He was once called the greatest artist the greatest Wisconsin artist that nobody knows. He has sculptures in the Rose Garden at the White House, and his sculptures, I just saw this particular sculpture here in the Eiteljorg Museum in Indianapolis. He has pieces in the National Gallery, the Canadian National Gallery. He's an amazing artist whose work really reflects his own environmental ethic. If you ever get a chance to see his work, sometimes he'll have exhibits at the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art. He was the first contemporary art curator of the National Museum of the American Indian. This latest, well, I guess it's not the latest Smithsonian museum anymore, but it's one of the newer ones. So I promised I wouldn't read anything, so I'll just end with one paragraph here. The native people whose lives are depicted here understood the cultural gravity that kept their people rooted to their ancestral lands and acted in ways that ensured the growth and success of future generations. So, Che Miigwech, thank you very much. And I'm told we can take a few questions. Yes.
I guess in taking the stories from an oral tradition to a written medium, is there a certain attitude you find among folks whose stories you're listening to, or are there specific challenges that you found in changing media?
That is such a great question, and thanks for asking it. Not so much in a book like this, because the stories that were told to me were stories that I very explicitly said, do you want to share this story? Can I share it? And here's how I wrote it. Is this okay with you? And so there was a lot of collaboration, and there was a lot of back and forth and self-editing on their part. Where it really trips me up is when I'm teaching. I teach a class on Native American environmental issues and the media, and I start with origin stories, creation stories. Because if you know, for example, that for the Hopi, who emerged from underground spaces and whose sacred places underground are called kivas, if you know that underground spaces are sacred to the Hopi, you can pretty much predict that they're going to have a problem with Peabody coal mining in their ancestral lands. And so I like to do that to put a cultural frame to the stories that become these contemporary environmental issues, like the Dakota Access Pipeline, for example, that become the stories that we see in the news. So some stories can only be told in the wintertime. And so there are certain classes that I will only teach in the wintertime because the stories I think are really crucial. And I have permission, I only use the stories that I have permission to tell, but some of those stories, not all of them, but some of them can only be told in the winter. So that's what the way I've sort of navigated around that. One of the biggest challenges was when I was asked to create an online version of this class. And then all of a sudden I'm losing control of when a story can be told and really had to do some editing. And one of the things that was really important to me was telling those stories orally. So in this online class, I orally told the stories, captured that on videotape, and that's what the students, because those stories should be heard, they shouldn't be read. But still, there were stories that I just couldn't share because it was the wrong time of the year. Great question, thanks.
I'm so glad when I opened the book up, and the first one was Walter. I've spent many nights around the fire with him, and he was just an incredible individual. And it was so sad that he passed away at such a young age.
And that same year, and in fact, I think I share that, although I edited it a little bit, what he actually said to me, in the beginning of each chapter, I sort of share a personal note about how I knew this person or why I was interested in sharing their story. And with Walter, I had seen him, this was the year that he passed actually. He was at Indian Summer Festival. He was a trader, and he and his wife had a trader booth there and sold books and tapes and that kind of thing. And I'd known Walter for years, and I would always stop over there and we'd chat up a storm. And he was one of these people, he always knew what was on the horizon. He always knew the next big Native story that was about to break. And so this was a good opportunity for me as a reporter to kind of see what was on the horizon in Indian country. And if you've ever been to Indian Summer Festival, there's this amazing fireworks display. And that year it was set to, it would have been 1992, because CBS had done a documentary series called 500 Nations. And Peter Buffett, the son of Warren Buffett, who's a composer, had scored the series. And had spent a lot of time with Native people in the Milwaukee area, and he'd done this amazing soundtrack. And so they're blowing off fireworks to his, awe-inspiring music. And Walter and I, when we'd heard the first boom signaling that the fireworks were about to start, he and I walked over to the lakefront, and all this fireworks display is going on, and I'd never seen fireworks set to music like that. And I can barely talk, and all I could say was, I mean, isn't that amazing? And he said, yes, I tend to have that effect on women.
Has Walter's story been passed on to someone else? I mean, he told you that long story. Someone else must know the story too.
There's a lot out there on Walter Brissett. And he really understood that I think he felt this obligation to share as much as the knowledge that he had. So there's lots of tapes out there. In fact, there's a wonderful website called The Ways, which is a series of documentaries. The Educational Communication Board did an animated piece called Tribal Sovereignty, and Walter Brissett, it's taken from his teachings. And it's an animated, it's really a great, simple explanation of tribal sovereignty, of a really complicated concept, for 4th and 5th graders. And it's a wonderful resource. there was an art show at the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art on State Street. And it was a woman that had done these amazing tombstones of all these famous Wisconsin people with, anybody remember what that was called? You know what I'm talking about? Anyway, all these famous Wisconsinites had their tombstones with pithy verses on it. And they were all different, but all kind of the same shape. And then you walked through it, and you walked into this dark place, and it was, you had to go through this curtain, and there was this huge tree sculpture. It looked and felt like a tree that you needed to step up to. There were little places for your footsteps, and then you started hearing crickets and wild noises and wind and Walt Brissett's voice talking about environmental ethics. It was just absolutely beautiful. So he's out there. If you Google him, you can find him. That guy's wisdom is ageless, and he keeps on and on and on. It's wonderful. Yes?
Yeah, with the viciousness that the authorities attacked the Native people at Standing Rock,
Yeah.
do you think that we will ever understand this concept of 7 generations? Are we any closer, or are we further away from this understanding?
Yeah, the question is, the gentleman is talking about the viciousness associated with the Dakota Access Pipeline protest. And some of you may have seen the water cannons that were aimed at people in sub-freezing temperatures. And for me, I mean, I looked at those images, and I was 11 years old again, watching the cannons aimed at black people trying to register to vote, during the 50s. And the dogs, that was really disturbing to see dogs sicked on human beings. And the optimist in me wants to believe that we'll get there. And whenever I get really depressed about things going on, I'm reminded that there's an Ojibwe prophecy that talks about this time. We think of, time is conceptualized as fires, and there's 7 fires. And each relates to a certain set of historical events. And if we can get our act together, this is a really precarious time we're living in, according to our philosophy, or according to our prophecies, where we're going to be asked to make a decision whether we're going to choose a hard, stony, pebbly path, or whether we're going to choose a path that's lush and green. And a lot of people have interpreted that to mean, are we going to choose an environmental path, or are we going to choose, this technological path? And did anybody watch Do You Trust This Computer on artificial intelligence? Bill Gates, I'm sorry to digress here, but this is really important. Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and Stephen Hawking have all said that artificial intelligence is the greatest threat to humanity. And when those 3 great minds, send out a warning, I'm listening. And there's a documentary out there called Do You Trust This Computer, which is about artificial intelligence and where we're headed and how we're creating these machines that are, they have a task, and they learn how to do that task, and then the speed with which they are able to take that and develop other logical procedures is just really frightening. And so you should really watch this documentary. It's a pretty interesting one. And so when I think about this lush green path or this this other route, it gives me pause. It gives me pause. But in that same prophecy. It says that new people will emerge, and it's very clear that it's not native people, it's non-native people. That the only way the Ojibwe are going to survive is if we band with these new people that are going to emerge and stand with us to make ethical choices. So I think about that a lot when I look at some developments, maybe even some in this area, that make me a little trepidatious, or a lot of there's a lot of trepidation maybe. I try to remember that, and I think about the 10,000 people that went to Standing Rock. They were not all Native people. There were plenty of non-Native people who stood, and there were plenty of non-Native people all across the world that sent donations to Standing Rock, that tried to support them in some way. One of the project that I'm working on right now is a collection of essays from Native journalists, academics, and community people writing about environmental challenges in their own community as a way of explaining why Dakota Access resonated the way it did. So, yeah, I'm optimistic. I have to be. What's the alternative?
We have to be optimistic, and we have to work together, don't we?
Yeah, we do. And if you go in the parking lot, you'll see my little Toyota hybrid with a little Water is Life bumper sticker on it. Yeah.
So just thinking about Standing Rock, are you aware of, and could you speak to the Sacred Water Walk that's going on this Saturday?
Do you want to share that information?
Okay, so this Saturday there's a Sacred Water Walk in Kashina Falls. Kashina Falls, thanks, I'm not from the north. To Menominee High School at 10 a.m. this Saturday. It's to support the Wisconsin Indigenous Water Protectors on the border of Michigan and Wisconsin. In Michigan, they're trying to mine there, and so this is a way to support people. If you're not able to go to the walk, they are accepting donations, and if you go to Facebook, it's Madison Action for Mining Alternatives, and there's a link there that you can donate to.
And these water walks, thanks so much for that. These water walks have been going on for about a decade, and it was started by an Ojibwe woman in Canada, Josephine Mandame, who, Grandma Josephine? She started walking around Lake Superior, and then, walking, people joined with her, and there were other Great Lakes. And a couple of years ago, there were indigenous women that walked from the four directions, from Hudson Bay, from the Gulf of Mexico, from the East Coast, the West Coast. This was right at the height of the Gogabec taconite mine threat. There was a plan to build what would have been a 22-mile long open pit taconite mine at the headwaters of our Wild Rice River. And so we were in full panic mode. And these women and their entourages walked from the four directions and got to Bad River, commingled their water in a copper pot, and returned it to Lake Superior. And when I could see again, because it was so moving, it goes back to your belief that, or your question about whether we're going to get through this and whether we're going to, realize that we can't drink, you can't drink oil, you can't drink money, you can't drink gold, and I just want to believe that some of these extraction officials who I don't understand why they're not worried about their own grandchildren. I'm worried for them about their grandchildren. I want them to have clean water. Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering if it has to get worse before it gets better, and I hate to say that, but
Can it get any worse?
the CAFO farming is so destructive that a big plant in Kenosha, what is it called?
Foxconn.
Foxconn. Nestle's sucking water out of Lake Michigan for what, $200 a day or some cheap thing. We buy it at the store, and then we go buy it. And there are so many other kinds of things that just get even more egregious.
Yes. And you look at Kewaunee County, you know, 1 out of every 3 wells that have been tested are polluted, contaminated. There are more CAFOs than human beings in that county. And you know, there's a plan to site a 28,000 animal hog farm 1/6 of a mile from a feeder stream into Lake Superior in Bayfield County. And you know, the mayor of Ashland, the city of Ashland, has said, you know, there's twice as many pigs as there are people in Ashland. Can you imagine the hue and cry if we said, you know what, we don't need a sanitary sewer system. We'll just liquefy our poop and we'll spread it on farm fields. That's what they're talking about. That's their management plan for this CAFO. Untreated, just liquefy everything and spray it on farm fields. There aren't enough farm fields for all that, for 9 million gallons of pig poop. But you know, it's so much worse with animals because they're in such close proximity. They're just pumped full of antibiotics, much more so than human beings are. And you know, you just look at what happened in Kewaunee County. Didn't we learn from that? Yeah.
Well, maybe with the tariff thing now, they won't have any place to sell their pigs, so they'll fall through.
There you go. Yeah, there is a silver lining, isn't there? Thank you so much. I really enjoyed you spending your time with me this evening.